All right. Good morning, everybody out there in internet land. We're glad that you're with us this morning, and we're looking at Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. You know, it's interesting because I talked about going through this passage, and last week I taught three aspects of just the why Jesus is a beautiful name, and I was going to do 4 this week. Well, I started studying yesterday and only got through 2. If I did all 4, we'd be here for like 3 hours. So I thought I'd give you guys a break, and my booty can't endure that long. So I figured none of yours could either. So we're going to go over 2 things. But I want to start, a little girl who was in the 1st grade in public school. And one day during a lesson about blue whales, she asked the question, can whales swallow people? Now, her teacher, Miss Stevens, explained that whales couldn't swallow people because they have a throat and pleats in the throat that filter plankton and krill. And so a person wouldn't be able to go past those points. Well, the girl responded, but Mrs. Thurston, my Sunday school teacher, says Jonah was swallowed by a whale. Mrs. Stevens, now getting a little angry, blue whales cannot swallow people, she said to the little girl. The little girl said, well, then when I get to heaven, I'll just ask Jonah if a whale really swallowed him. Mrs. Stevens, still red with anger, said, what if Jonah went to hell? The little girl said to the teacher, well, then you can ask him. I love that. A woman and a man who were watching their children play at a playground eventually got into this conversation, and after a while, the man called out to his son who was on his swing and saying it was time to go home. The son pleaded, just 5 more minutes, Dad, please, just 5 more minutes. The father agreed to the child's earnest plea. After a few minutes, the father called out to his son again saying, hey, it's time to go home. Once again, the son pleaded, 5 more minutes, Dad, just 5 more minutes. The father gladly agreed with the child's request for a second time. While listening to the conversation between father and son, the woman complimented the man on his patience. The father replied, my older son, Tommy, passed away last year, and I've never spent much time with Tommy. Now I'd give anything for just 5 more minutes with him. I vowed not to make the same mistake with Sam. He thinks he has 5 more minutes to swing. The truth is I get 5 more minutes to watch him play. Our children always have a way of putting things in perspective for us. And then one last one. The father of a very wealthy family, he sent his 10-year-old son on a trip to the country with the express purpose of showing him how poor people live. He spent a couple of days and nights on the farm of what would be considered just a very, very poor family. On his return from the trip, his father asked him, son, how was the trip? Well, it was great, Dad. Did you see how the poor people live? The father asked, oh, yeah, said the son. So tell me, what did you learn from the trip? Asked the father. Well, this is the son's answer. He said, I saw that we have 1 dog and they had 4. We have a pool that reaches to the middle of our garden. They have a creek that has no end. We have imported lanterns in our garden and they have the stars at night. Our patio reaches to the front yard and they have the whole horizon. We have a small piece of land to live on and they have fields that go beyond sight. We have servants who serve us, but they serve others. We buy our food. They grow theirs. We have walls around our property to protect us. They have friends to protect them. The boy's father was speechless. Then his son added, thanks, Dad, for showing me how poor we are. Now, I share those 3 different stories because those stories show me perspective's important. Perspective is everything. How we choose to see something, depending on the angle you see it from, can change everything. David was the only one to walk into the valley of Elah, face Goliath because of what? His perspective. He wasn't looking at this giant coming to face the children of Israel, this dude that had a spear bigger than he was tall and was stronger than he'd ever dream of being. He wasn't thinking of that. Everyone in Israel and the Israeli army saw Goliath as this giant, a warrior, an unbeatable foe. But not from David's perspective. David saw him as an uncircumcised Philistine that was making fun of the living God that David loved. And you just don't know you just don't let someone get away with that in David's perspective. It wasn't that David was some extra tough dude necessarily. I mean, we talk about David's mighty men and a warrior and all that later on, but this time he's just a shepherd boy, In fact, he's at this point in time, he wasn't even old enough to go to the war. And when the prophet came to anoint the next king, David's dad didn't even invite him to the party. This is how he was thought of. But David saw someone blaspheming his God, and enough was enough, and David just knew that from his perspective that you can't do that. And his God was greater. I think of another story. Imagine waking up to find you're completely surrounded by enemies. Think of that. How would you react? with fear, with despair, or could you see that your enemies are dust compared to the might of our God? It's perspective, right? I mean, God's prophet Elijah found himself in this situation after giving valuable advice to the Israel's army. So the king of Syria decided to take Elijah as a prisoner, send an army to the city where the prophet was staying. Under the cover of darkness, the Syrian warriors surrounded the city. When Elijah's servant woke early in the morning to begin his usual routine, he found himself looking out over an army of Syrians that just appeared there overnight. And he cried out to his master in panic, saying, "What are we going to do? What's going to happen?" I get that response, right? For the prophet Elijah, the choice was just clear. And his answer to his servant was simple and was full of faith. 2 Kings 6, verse 16, he said, "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Perspective. This would have been a real difficult answer for the servant to accept, because he could look out over the wall of enemies and see their sharp spears, their swords, their gigantic shields. And that servant certainly didn't see anybody really willing to fight on their side. But because Elijah had a different perspective, he saw the situation in a completely different way. He spoke to the Lord on behalf of the servant, saying, I love this verse, 2 Kings 6:17. I think it's a verse that we should all have underlined in our Bible. Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Open his eyes that he may see. And suddenly the servant was able to see with the same perspective as Elijah. The hills, excuse me, the hills around the city weren't empty at all. In fact, a mighty host of horses and chariots of fire stood in wait, sent by the Lord to protect them. And it was okay. Now we know another story. The Lord sent one angel to kill, a big Assyrian army and stuff. This was a different situation. But the servant Elijah went from, the servant of Elijah went from fear to faith the instant his perspective changed. It was how he chose to look at it. I think of a verse in Daniel 11, verse 32. It's something that, maybe many of you have read over, but how many of us have really thought about what it says? And it's interesting because the last half of the verse is the one that sticks in my heart so strongly. The beginning says, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries." But this, in the second part, "But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. You guys, no matter how big the enemy might be or how dark the day might seem, how large the battle might appear, the people that truly know their God will be strong and do great exploits, because we realize that if God be for us, who can be against us? It says in Romans 8:31, right? The gutsiest people in the world should be believers who know their God, who don't back down or give up in the face of a challenge, and who simply say, I know the Lord's with me, and no matter how dark the day might be, I'm going to continue doing what he's called me to do, because God has changed my perspective. Because where you might see a mountain, God lets me see a molehill. All it takes is a change of our perspective, and we can all go from fear to faith as well. And so perspective is why the book of Hebrews begins the way it does. Because the writer is writing to Jewish believers who, because of persecution and fear, are beginning to think about forsaking Christ and going back into Judaism. They've counted the cost. It's taken this huge toll. They're worried. They've lost so much, and they're thinking from their perspective, has it been worth it? Has it really been worth it? And so he's writing to them to make sure they know who they're considering forsaking. He says, let me have a moment to change your perspective on who Jesus really is. It's not about their circumstances changing. It's about their perspective changing. And the writer is going to build a case, chapter after chapter, revealing how every single important person and aspect of the Old Testament and Judaism was a picture or a shadow pointing to Jesus, the real thing. Let me tell you something. He's saying, I'm talking to you not about the greatest rabbi that ever lived, not about someone who gave us a great example of love and sacrifice, not about somebody who, did incredible things, miracles and all these things. I'm here to tell you this. I want to change your perspective on who Jesus is, because you need to understand he is God. That's just what he was telling them. Why would you want the shadow or the picture of something when you can have the real thing? So he's trying to show him. He goes, we've told you about Jesus because he's the fulfillment of everything you hoped for and dreamed of in the Old Testament. It's fulfilled in him. That was a shadow. He's the real thing. Every year my family orders presents for each other, for different holidays, events, whatever it is, from Christmas to birthdays to Father's Day, Mother's Day, you name it, off the internet. We all do that now. It's so convenient, right? And it makes things easier than going to the mall, which I hate crowds and I don't like doing that anyway. And then, or a store that might have limited selection. You can find anything on Amazon, right? So what do we do when the worst happens? The thing you ordered isn't going to come in time for the occasion. You ever had that happen? It's like, oh, crud, whatever, supply chain. I don't care what the excuse is. It doesn't matter what their excuse is. I don't have a present to give to the person that I'm looking for, When that happens, what we do is we'll put a picture of the item in a card or in the box that they can open up. And that's telling them that, hey, this is coming. This is what you have to look forward to. And now, it's not the same or as good as the real thing, but it is telling the family member, hey, something great's coming. This is what you have to look forward to. Something good's coming. And that's the Old Testament, you guys. All these pictures of Jesus in the Old Testament, all of the incredible things that the prophets did, all of the kings and the accomplishments and the victories they made, all the prophecies that the prophets spoke, all the people and the way they obeyed the Lord. Anytime they did anything worth anything at all of value, it was a pale reflection of the future that was coming in Christ. It was just pointing to him. It's like putting that picture in the package. It's not the real thing, but it points to the real thing. It tells you it's coming. You're going to get this eventually. And that's the thing that the writer of Hebrews is trying to tell to the Jews. You guys, listen, you opened up the package and you've just got a picture of what's coming, but it's not the real thing. Don't settle. You don't have to settle for less. Why settle for the law when you have Jesus who delivers you from the law? Why settle for God's judgment when you have Jesus who's there to show you grace and mercy? This is what I'm trying to tell you, he says. And this is what the writer of Hebrews writes this book all about. And here's the thing. I sure hope that nobody here this morning, myself included, would ever think about totally forsaking Jesus. I don't think any of us would. Nobody's contemplating that or walking away from Jesus and going back into the world. But here's the thing. All of us at some point or time in our lives have regularly struggled with fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of deciding how much are we really going to trust the Lord in, because, man, it's hard to trust in something and someone we can't see when what we see in front of us is serious and real and a problem. It's a difficult thing. How much of our lives are we going to surrender to him? How much control are we going to give him for our lives, for our marriages, for our families, for our businesses, our jobs, our friendships? And most of the time, I really think that our fear, our hesitancy to trust has to do with our perspective. Either we don't know or we forget who Jesus is. Therefore, we don't trust what he can do. And so that's why the book of Hebrews is such an incredible book, not just for Jews, but for all of us. Because when you look at it and you see who Jesus really is, your perspective changes. And you realize, well, he can do anything. These little things in my life that are going on, these little road bumps that I'm going through, even though they seem huge and insurmountable to me, for him, it's nothing. It's nothing. Now, I say it's nothing. It's not insignificant, because if it matters to us, it matters to him. But his ability to handle it it takes nothing from him. It takes no power at all. And I pray today that all of us really see Jesus, really consider him, that we trust him with our whole hearts, and basically let 1 John 4:18 take place. Perfect love casts out all fear. The more we fall in love with Jesus, the more we recognize who he is and what he's able to do, the less fear we'll feel, the less struggle we'll have. And so my prayer for today is for us to change our perspective and let Jesus turn our fear into faith. Now, last time we were together, I spoke about the writer of Hebrews telling us this amazing story about Jesus, how he just was painting this thing out. Okay, so every Led Zeppelin fan is familiar with the song, A Stairway to Heaven. It's one of the all-time greatest songs, in my opinion, there is. In fact, that's what put them on the map. That's like the penultimate song. And it's crazy because when that song was released, it's 10 minutes. Radios are going to play that. It's just a crazy thing. And yet, in spite of the length of the song and the slow build up and everything, it just became this huge thing that just exploded on the scene. The song builds and builds and builds, and it takes the listener on a journey up each step as you climb closer and closer till this crescendo just sweeps you up and the music explodes with power. You almost feel like you've made this journey up a stairway to heaven. I mean, that's the whole point of the song, how it builds and does that. Now, here in the first 3 verses, I think is an even more beautiful stairway. You know, it's a stairway from heaven. How God left his rightful throne in heaven, came down to earth, humbled himself to become one of his creation, lived a perfect sinless life, then sacrificed his life on the cross for our sin. And you guys, power's not found in a stairway to heaven. Where we have to be good enough, you know, to climb or try to buy or earn our way in. True power is found in Jesus, who climbed down the stairway from heaven to rescue us from our sin, to give us salvation that we could never hope to buy or to earn on our own. And that's the stairway that blows my mind when we look at this, you know. And in only the first 3 verses, we see these 7 reasons Jesus has such a beautiful name. So let's read the verses, the 3 verses again, and then I'm going to get into it. So Hebrews 1, verses 1 through 3, it says, God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom also he made the worlds, who being in the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had by himself purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. Woo! That's incredible. I mean, what a stairway from heaven, to come down from heaven to earth, to come down to relate to one of us. And last week, to each of us, and last week we covered the first 3 reasons that we can say Jesus has a beautiful name. We talked about his position. He's heir of all things, our elder brother, willing to share his inheritance with us. But he's not an older brother who's selfish, saying, hey, it's mine. You know, you got to go make your own way. Daddy gave it to me. No, he's a brother that says, listen, everything I have is yours because I love you. And then his prowess, our creator, so brilliant, he can create the universe and all the laws that govern it, and such a genius that he was able to create something as complex as us in an instant. That's incredible. And then his power, he's so powerful, he's able to hold the universe and all of our atoms and molecules together, while at the same time listening to our prayers and providing for our needs. So we get this picture of this incredible, magnificent, powerful, amazing God in heaven, but Jesus left his position. He left his prowess, he left his power in heaven and walked a stairway from heaven to us. And it doesn't stop there. This morning, I want us all to look at the first 2 of the final 4 reasons he has such a beautiful name. So the first one, we're going to look at these 2 things this morning, his radiance and his revelation. Let's begin with his radiance. He comes down to earth now, and we look at this. The Bible talks about his radiance, this passage of scripture. It says, who being the brightness of his glory. He's the brightness of the Father in heaven's glory. You guys, this word brightness in the original language is a word that denotes radiance that shines forth from the source of light. It's a really cool word. It's basically saying Jesus is the beam of God's glory. We can't look at the sun, can we? You can look at the sun, but it'll blind you. You know, and if you want to look at the sun during an eclipse, you got to put these special glasses on. And you know how you did that in school when there's going to be an eclipse. You know, you made those glasses and everybody's out there, oh, checking it out, you know. But if you just stare at the sun for just a moment or 2, it messes up your eyes. It leaves this imprint, this after image, and then it can eventually destroy your vision. If you look too long, your eyes are destroyed. Well, none of us can look on God without being destroyed, consumed. We can only see the rays of the sun's light as it comes and lights up the world around us. Well, that's Jesus. We can't look on God, it'll be destroyed. So he sent himself, he clothed himself in humanity so that we can see the rays of the Father's light in the Son Jesus. See him through the rays of his Son's light. Isn't that incredible? John 14, 7 through 8, it says, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you'll know him and have seen him. And Philip said to him, one of the disciples, Lord, show us the Father, and it's sufficient for us. And that's all we want to do, he says. Just show us the Father. That's all we care about. I love Philip, you guys. Philip was cool. I mean, he's such the opposite of me and who I am, and I think that's why in some ways he appeals to me. You know, I identify with Peter, but I really like Philip. And the reason why is because Philip is this quiet guy, the opposite of Peter. I get this impression when I read about him that Philip didn't talk a lot. You know, he's a man of few words, but when he spoke, it mattered. You know, he has a Greek name, and some Bible students believe that he was Greek, but that doesn't have to be. He could have been Jewish with a Greek name, you know. They were influenced by the Greeks around him. He's a very unusual man, because every time we meet him, every time the Bible talks about Philip, he's bringing someone to Jesus. I love that. Remember that he brought Nathaniel. Nathaniel was also another comedian. He was another boisterous guy. He had a big personality. You know, you see these two guys, you see Philip being all mellow and quiet, and you see Nathaniel and he's all bold and stuff like that. And quiet Philip brings people to Jesus. You guys, let me tell you something. We don't have to be bold, outgoing personalities or a people person to bring people to Jesus. Maybe some of you are shyer, you're more closed off, you're a little more insular. That's okay, because all you have to do is introduce people to the Jesus you know. You just have to know him. It doesn't take this huge personality to share your faith. The people can see Jesus in our lives when we're living for him. And I love that, because, you know, we can be witnesses no matter what part of the personality spectrum we find ourselves on. You know, I love that. And you look at all the disciples and the unique people they were, the different personalities, and here you have Philip, you know, this quiet dude, but when he spoke, it mattered. And he's saying these huge things. And right there, he says something profound. He goes, all that matters, just show us the Father. You know, just show us the Father. I'd like to ask you this personal question today. You don't have to answer. I'm not putting you on the spot, but what are your desires in life? You know, what's your ultimate goal? Do you want to get rich? Do you want to make a name for yourself? Do you want to educate your children? Do you want to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord? You know, all those goals are fine, you know, some even really worthy goals, but the most important goal we could ever have is to know the Father. Philip hit the nail on the head. Just want to know the Father. Just want to know God. Why are we here? What's this all about? What's our purpose for living? You know, I just want to know him more. John 14:9, Jesus said to Philip, he said, have I been with you so long and yet you've not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. So how can you say, show us the Father? Jesus says, you're looking at him. If you want to see the radiance of the Father, if you want to see the light shining from the throne of heaven, just look at me, Philip. It's Jesus. Philip knew from the Old Testament that Moses had seen the radiance of God, and Isaiah had a vision of the radiance of God. And although Philip had not seen that radiance of God that way as Moses or Isaiah did, he'd seen Jesus. He'd witnessed his words, his work. He'd seen the light shining from God in the things that Jesus did, and the way he taught, and the things he shared with people. The witness, the testimony that Jesus gave, everything that Philip wished to see, Jesus was saying, you've seen it in me, Philip. You've seen God when you've seen me. In Christ, there's so much greater revelation of God than anything in the Old Testament, because here they finally had the real thing in front of them. And that's why in 1 John, it's so important when he says that which we have seen with our eyes, which we have held in our hands, you know, and felt, what our hands have touched, you know. He talks about we had the real thing. And Philip had the greatest revelation of God because he'd seen him in the flesh and been with him in his presence for 3 years. And the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is the brightness of the radiance of the Father's glory. That's incredible. We're reading that right now, and that's what Jesus was. The glory of God's really an interesting topic, because in Old Testament, the glory is this word kabod, and it means weight, heaviness. It's a heavy subject. It's a sobering thing, something to take serious. When the Old Testament talks about the glory of God, it's always in a sobering, serious, reverential way. Sometimes it can seem a little frightening even. And it's interesting. It reminds me the first time that my niece met my wife's boss. He's 7'1". You know, she was just teeny at that time. And it was so funny because she looked at him and she started at his feet. It just went up and kept going up. Up. And then she saw him and she didn't say anything. You know, you're wondering, like some kids might burst out in tears, some kids might run, but she just went, a little nervous giggle. You know, it's like, holy crud, this guy's immense. Is he going to squash me? Is he going to be nice to me? What's he going to do? You know, I mean, it was just so uncertain. Then he offered her string cheese, and that's it. That's all she wrote. It sealed their relationship. Quickest way to her heart's through her stomach. You know, so there you go. But she was overwhelmed, you know, when she saw this big guy in front of her. Well, imagine seeing the glory of God. How overwhelming, how powerful. Would we cry? Would we fall to our knees? Would we turn around and run? Would we be terrified? I mean, look at Exodus chapter 24, verses 16 and 18 through 18. It says, now the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, in this kabod, this weight. And the cloud covered it 6 days, and on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. We know, most of us are familiar with this story and a little bit of the background. And so, Moses goes up to meet with God. They're looking up at this mountain. They're seeing the weight of God's glory, and it looks like it's consuming fire. And then what do they see? They see their leader, the main man, the dude himself that delivered them from Egypt, parted the Red Sea, that's, called manna down from heaven to feed them, that made sure their shoes never wore out and their clothes never got worn. And he goes into this thing, and they're like, he's never coming back. That's it. We lost him. We're done. What are we going to do now? Well, we know what they did. The golden calf and all that stuff took place and happened, and this ticked off Moses. We know all about that. And, I used to think, man, when I look at the children of Israel and I think, oh, darn, they were fickle. These guys were weak. Come on. And how faithless, how quick would they turn away from God? And I'd like to look at myself and think, man, I've never done that. And then I read about the glory of God and this consuming fire from the mountain, and I think, I probably would have thought the same thing. He's never coming back. No one goes into that kind of fire and survives. When he disappeared, they thought that's it. We know Moses survived, but look what happened later. Moses was there, covered under the weight of the glory of God, this profound experience, hearing the voice of God on this mountain. And it wasn't even God's physical presence. He was just, the glory alone was there. And it was this incredible thing. And Moses survived it. And it was Moses, after that experience, saying, I saw a little glimpse of your glory, God, your radiance. I want to see the whole thing. Show me more. I love that about Moses. He wasn't satisfied. God, I just want more of you. Man, I want that in my life. Sometimes I feel like in my walk with the Lord, I get to a place where it's like, I'm balancing my walk with the Lord. I'm balancing my family. I'm balancing the illnesses I struggle with. I'm balancing the relationships. And it's like, man, I feel sometimes like I'm juggling all these things. And, it's so time consuming. I just want to not worry about that and say, Lord, I just want more of you. Just want more of you. And it says in Exodus 33, 17 through 23, this is great. It says, so the Lord said to Moses, I'll also do this thing that you have spoken. For you found grace in my sight, and I know you by name. I love that. What's more important, that Moses knows God by name, or that God knows Moses by name? That God knows Moses by name. And he said, please show me your glory. Then he said, I'll make all my goodness pass before you, and I'll proclaim the name of the Lord before you, and I'll be gracious to whom I'm gracious, and I'll have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But he said, you can't see my face, for no man shall see me and live. Whoa. Just seeing a little glimpse of his glory, the covering, that all-consuming fire, and that wasn't even the whole thing. That was hardly anything. And now he's saying, show me more. And God says, okay, I will. He says, and the Lord said, here is a place by me, and you'll stand on this rock. So it shall be when my glory passes by, I'm going to put you in the cleft of this rock. So this split where the rock is. You stand there, and I'm going to cover you with my hand while I pass by. Then I'll take away my hand, and you'll see my back, and my face shall not be seen. Whoa, what a huge rigmarole thing they have to go through just to see just the back of God. This is incredible. And guys, back doesn't mean butt. I've heard some people teach that. Oh, but God could only show him his butt. What it literally means is his afterglow, the after image, that after impression of him. God's saying to Moses, you can't see me and live, but you can sense and experience my afterglow. You can see that effect. You can feel that light, that radiance, that brilliance shining off of me. Just a little shadow of who I am. But it's going to be so much, it'll blow your mind anyway. So the only way Moses could see God's afterglow was if he was in the cleft of the rock. Who's the rock in the Bible? Jesus. What's a cleft? What's a crack? It's a break in the rock. It's a wound in the stone. Our rock, Jesus, was cleft, wounded on the cross for us. And Colossians 3:3 says, for you're dead and your life is hid with Christ in God. The only way we'll ever see anything in God's glow or glory, his radiance, is when we fix our eyes on Jesus and we stand in the rock. See that picture, that little shadow of the Christ that would come, that would be there. Just like Moses, if we were to fully see the glory of the radiance of God, we'd die. Moses is no different from us. We're no different from him. If God showed us his full glory, his full radiance, boom, we burnt to crisp. Done. That's it. Here's something, though, I found interesting when I was studying about this. If you think about it, it's kind of an amazing thing that if you want to really, really, truly see the glory, the radiance of Jesus, we also have to die too. Die to ourselves. Die to our preconceived ideas. Die to our empty lives. Die to our old nature and become born again in his spirit with new life, new eyes, new hope, and a new nature. So it still takes death to look upon Jesus in his glory, but it's a spiritual kind of death. Exodus 34:5, it says, now the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with him there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. Wow. So this cloud mentioned was no doubt the cloud of the radiance of God's glory. You guys, here's the thing. So now we're seeing in Hebrews that Jesus was the image, the brilliance of the image of God's radiance, right? He's this shining light of God. So this cloud that came down that was the radiance of God's glory covered Mount Sinai in Exodus 19. It went with Israel by day in Exodus 13. It went to the tent of Moses in Exodus 33. It filled the temple with glory in 2 Chronicles 7:2. Overshadowed Mary at the conception of Jesus in Luke 1:35. It was present at the transfiguration of Jesus in Luke 9. And it will be present at the return of Jesus, Revelation 1:7. Surrounded about such a great cloud of witnesses, this glory of God that comes down. You guys, so we see the radiance of Jesus. When we see him, we're seeing the glory of God, that very presence of Emmanuel, God with us. See how powerful this stuff is? No other reason. This is why his name is beautiful, because he's the radiance of the glory of God. He shines with the power of God. If you want to know what God looks like, look at Jesus. See him. We're seeing him, but and it gets even better from there. It gets even better because we look at the passage of scripture that we're reading, and it says also that he's the express image of his person. The express image of his person. Hey, come on, computer. I'm having computer issues here. It says he's the express image of his person. I'm almost there, guys. I had a little hiccup. Okay, cool. So let's talk now about his revelation. We talked about his radiance. Now we're talking about his revelation, the express image of his person. All around the world, everywhere we go, one of the main questions that's common to mankind is, why are we here? What's our purpose? How did it all happen? What's the deal? What's going on with this place? Is there a God? Is there not? What's the truth about all this stuff? Well, we have the Word of God, and we believe that. If God told you about himself, what would he say? Do you want to know about who God is and what he's like? What would he say about himself? Well, here's the beautiful thing. We have the scriptures, and he speaks about who he is. He reveals himself to us. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, it's funny because he named the inhabitants Indians. He thought he'd reached Europe, the Europeans. He thought he'd reached the Indies, China, Japan, and India, the Far East. In fact, he was not even close to South or East Asia. He just was mistaken. And so that's why, Native Americans are called Indians to this day, because he thought he was thinking Indians, And his path was just this vast region of land that was in the way, unexplored, uncharted, and unexpected. Columbus didn't know why it was there or what it was. He assumed that the world was smaller than he thought it was. They didn't really understand it. And I think sometimes we've made a similar mistake when we look at Jesus Christ, because there are these vast tracts in the Bible of who he is, according to the biblical revelations, that are just unexplored about the depth, the height, the breadth of who Jesus is. And sometimes have we unintentionally reduced him to maybe a manageable, predictable, size, a little portion we can swallow? Have we been looking at a junior varsity decaffeinated one-dimensional Jesus of our own making, thinking we're looking at the real thing? Sometimes I think we are. Have we snorkeled in the shallow thinking, oh, when I hit the bottom, I've hit the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, not realizing there's the Marianas Trench, you haven't even touched the bottom. That's what Jesus is all about, you guys. We could study him our whole entire lives and never reach the bottom of who he really is and the radiance of his glory and the revelation of God to us through his son. And if you really want to know how great God is, how fully capable he is to handle anything that we throw at him, you're in luck. We don't have to wonder. We don't have to doubt or worry. He told us about himself. Look at Exodus 34, 6 and 7. So this is right after all that stuff went down that we talked about with God's glory coming down on him and showing himself to Moses just by the afterglow. And this is what he says about himself. He says, and the Lord passed before him and proclaimed. So that's the Lord saying this. He's proclaiming. He's telling you something about himself. The Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the father upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. We want to know who God is. He tells us about himself. He's merciful and gracious. This is how he reveals himself. He talks about who he is. And if you wanted to see God and if you want to know what God is like, he's telling us right here. Merciful and gracious. Merciful is better translated full of compassion. That's a better translation for that word in Hebrew, the original language. It's full of compassion. The word translated gracious comes from the idea to bend or stoop in kindness to an inferior, to favor, to bestow. It reminds me like of an elderly person that may bend down and ruffle the hair of a little child and give them time and maybe give them a buck or, a piece of candy and stuff. You just, here's this person that's just taking time out of their day to spend time with this little child. Doesn't mean anything, but it means a lot to that child. That's this idea of grace. It's grace given to the undeserving. He's long-suffering, slow to anger. He doesn't get exasperated with these. He's not uptight. Man, I'm not slow to anger, especially driving. Man, my dad and I had to deal with some crazy drivers on the road. When you pull in a big rig, it gets even worse because they do all kinds of crazy stuff. We got cut off by big old diesel trucks. And, we got guys, revving up to go around us and tailgated and you name it. And I'm telling you, it's like, my gosh, this is like a crucible of patience to try to learn to go through and have. And I failed. But Dale Irwin said this. He said, perhaps since anger so accurately reflects the human situation, we who tend to shape our gods into our image find it beyond our comprehension that the true God, the one who shaped us in his image, would be long-suffering. He adds, any normal human being would have abandoned or obliterated me by now, but the God of compassion and grace patiently waits for my inch-by-inch progress. Isn't that awesome? I'm so glad that a characteristic that God has is long-suffering. That means he can put up with me. And then it says abounding. That means overflowing. It's not merely adequate, but abounding is this great God of glory. He has barns and silos full of love and faithfulness, and he's stacking it in the streets just looking for someone to give it to. That's what this picture is of. His goodness, that means loving kindness and truth is all that is right and just and fair. He says, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. You guys, you know what's beautiful about that? Just in those 3 words in that little sentence, that covers the full gamut of sin. Unintentional, outright rebellion, and every kind is mentioned in those 3 words. That he covers it all. He's able to forgive. He's able to forgive whatever we do. By no means clearing the guilty. You guys, God did not randomly clear the guilty. That wouldn't be true and just. He sent his son Jesus to take the punishment, to pay the price. Forgiveness is now possible, but those who reject what Jesus did, they'll have to answer for their sin. That's a fact. But God's going to keep, because of his love, because he's long-suffering, because he's patient, he won't give up on anybody. I'm convinced that God will not give up on anybody till their dying breath. Because that's his patience, his grace, his love, reaching out until the last possible moment, trying to tug on someone's heart, bring them to that place where they'll repent, one generation after another, never giving up. Okay, maybe you passed away, but you know what? I'm going to keep going for your children. I'm going to keep with them. So God was revealing his character and his name to Moses on the mountain, and he tells us exactly who he is and what he is like. You guys, when we think of all those things, does that scripture remind you of anybody you've heard about and read about? Jesus, exactly. The writer of Hebrews says that Jesus is the direct revelation of who God is. If you want to see if it's possible for someone to act just the way God described he is, look at Jesus. Because that's how he lived. That's who he is. When Jesus came, the literal glory of God was hidden in his flesh. Peter, James, and John caught a glimpse on the Mount of Transfiguration. And it said in 1 John 1:14, we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. You guys, that directly connects it back to Exodus 34:6-7. Because that talks about God's grace and his truth, right? Where God tells us what he's like. And if you want God to reveal himself to you, look at Jesus. Because it's in his life we see the full revelation of who God is. Isn't that amazing? This question, everybody's wanting to know, what's God like? Did God create us? What's the whole deal? You know, guys, it's a question that people ask all the time without even realizing you can know it. Open up his word. He tells you himself. If you want to know what God is like, read about it. He tells you himself, and he walked this earth to show us what he's like. That word full there, full of grace and truth, in John, it means that you couldn't have any more, not lacking in any way. When John looked at Jesus, he saw a normal man on the outside. He didn't glow. In fact, he was so normal and common, Judas had to go up and kiss him just to point out who he was when he betrayed him. He wasn't the best looking. He wasn't. I mean, we see these pictures of Jesus, and he's almost so pretty, he looks like a chick. You know, this long flowing hair, and he got this face and these deep, brooding eyes, and it's like, Brad Pitt, back in the day and stuff like that. Everybody's like, oh my gosh. The Bible says that you couldn't pick him out of a crowd. He just blended right in. Physically, it's this normal guy on the outside. But what caught John's attention was the glory that he saw inside of him. What made him stand out? Guys, it wasn't his looks. That's why sometimes those pictures and those ideas and those representations of Christ that someone paints or draws frustrate me, because you're emphasizing the wrong thing. The outside doesn't matter. The inside's where it matters. It's what came out of his life, that glory that he showed, the way that he loved, the way that he lived, the way that he laughed, the way that he smiled and cried and cared. That's what shows the glory of God. The way he healed, the way he forgave sins, the way he cast out demons, the way he spoke to the wind, be still, and it was still. That's what shows the glory of God. It had nothing to do with looks. It had nothing to do with physical strength. It had everything to do with what was inside coming out of him. That's what he says was amazing, was attractive, was unique, was one of a kind, was this glory of God that shone from out of Jesus in every move he made and every word he spoke and everything he did. His action showed who he was, full of grace and truth. Yeah. And grace is the generosity of love, you guys. Grace is love giving of itself. That's what grace is. Truth is all that is right and pure and just and holy. Jesus was the walking, talking, living, breathing example, the perfect blending of those two things. That's what John saw. That was his glory. That was what was outshining from God when he, his kabod, the weight of his glory was on that mountain. And that's what was revealed in the actions, the life, the words of Christ as he walked this earth. His revelation, the express image of his person. Jesus is the revelation of God because Jesus is God. Christ not only was God manifested, he was God in substance. Jesus is the perfect personal imprint of God in time and space. And Colossians 1:15, he's the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. People have had a lot of ideas about what God's like. The Hindus say, well, God must be loving, benevolent, and gentle, so he's a cow, The American Indian, watching an eagle soar majestically up in the wind current, said, God's like an eagle. He's an eagle. The ancient Egyptians saw the awesome power of the sun that they couldn't even look at it. It blinded them and said, God is Ra, but God is the sun. Each culture spoke a partial truth, but all of them missed the total picture because they were blind. And so God revealed himself to humanity. He's all of that. He's gentle and he's kind. And he's beautiful and soars and majestic. And he's awesome in his power and his radiance. So what did God do? He came and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ. When I want to know what God is like, I don't have to try to figure out his nature. I don't have to question. I don't have to ask why. I just have to open up the word and study the life of Jesus. And then I know he reveals the fullness of God. He's the express image of his person, the revelation of God. The story is told of a prince and his family who were captured by the enemy king. And when he was brought before the enemy king, the prince was asked by the enemy king, "What will you give me if I release you?" "Well, half my wealth," was the prince's reply. "Well, if I release your children?" "Everything I possess." "What if I release your wife?" The prince said, "Your Majesty, for her I'll give myself." The king was so moved by the prince's devotion to his family that he freed them all. And as they returned home, the prince said to his wife, "Wow, wasn't the king a handsome man?" With a look of deep love for her husband, she said to him, "I didn't notice. I could keep my eyes only on the one who was willing to give himself for my sake." Whew. Guys, that was God's purpose in sending his son, Jesus, so that Jesus could give himself for our sake. Jesus is the revelation of God himself, the express image of his person, the radiance of God's character, so we love him and give our lives to him. It's a relationship that's based on love, not law, devotion, not duty. And people ask the question all the time, why? And the world, the atheists, "Oh, this doesn't make any sense." And they mock us and say, this flying spaghetti monster in the sky and all these things. And they have all these opinions, but I think in this one story I'm going to share, it brings it all home. Why would he humble himself and do what he did? Why, in what kind of radical fantasy would it be that God would come down to this earth? Why would he do that? I mean, we have all kinds of stories of the Greek gods and they, people that became gods, but why would God become us? Well, Nabil Qureshi was a Muslim convert to Jesus Christ, and he had a resolutely Muslim friend named Sahar, who was attracted to parts of Christianity, but couldn't accept the idea of God becoming a human being. That just was stumping her. Couldn't accept it. On one occasion, she honestly asked, she said, "How can you believe that Jesus is God if he is born through the birth canal of a woman and then he had to use the bathroom and stuff?" She goes, "Aren't those things beneath God? Aren't those things blasphemous? Aren't those things irreverent to God?" Qureshi affirmed her question and then asked her one of his own. "Sahar, let's say that you're on your way to a very important ceremony and are dressed in your finest clothes and you're about to arrive just on time, but when you see your daughter drowning in a pool of mud, what would you do? Let her drown? Arrive looking dignified, or rescue her but arrive at the ceremony covered in mud?" Her response was very matter of fact. "Of course, I'd jump in the mud and save her." Nuancing the question more, Qureshi asked her, "Let's say there were others with you. Would you send someone else to save her, or would you save her yourself?" Well, she responded, "If she's my daughter, how could I send anyone else? They'd not care for her like I do. I'd go myself, definitely." Qureshi said, "If you, being human, love your daughter so much that you're willing to lay aside your dignity to save her, how much more can we expect of God? If he's our loving Father, to lay aside his majesty to save us." The biblical story of God eventually won her heart. And Qureshi reported the message of God's selfless love and overpowered her. And she could no longer remain a Muslim, and she became a follower of Christ. You see, doesn't it make sense when put that way? Why would God humiliate himself to come out of heaven, to come down, be stuck on this ball of mud, go through what we go through? Because love will do anything. Love knows no limits, knows no bounds. And Jesus is the radiance of who God is and the revelation of how God loves us. He was willing to walk the stairway from heaven down to this earth to save us from our sin because no one else could or would. And for that, we praise his beautiful name. We praise his beautiful name. Today's the first Sunday in the month, and okay, everybody out there on internet land, I love you guys. God bless each one of you. We're going to continue on with corporate communion here. I'm going to have my dad's going to pass